Gordon Hayward was not always a great basketball player. At a young age, his father told him that he'd always be short. And since both of his parents were 5'10", there was no reason to believe that anything would be different for him. Being 5'11" as a freshman in high school, Hayward did not grow into a 6'7" frame until he was a senior. Before reaching his 6'7" height, he was more known for his skills in tennis, as he was a two-time All-State player in the sport. Since Hayward got really tall, it made sense that his basketball abilities would get much better. As a senior, Hayward averaged 18 points, 8.4 rebounds, and 3.6 assists per game. Selected to the All-State second team by the Associated Press and the first team All-State by the Indiana Basketball Coaches Association, it was fair to say that at this point, Hayward was quite a good basketball player. Being an unranked prospect by ESPN and having an unranked 3-star rating by Rivals, Hayward was not heavily recruited by tons of schools, but there were a few that had some interest. Michigan, Northwestern, and Purdue all had interest in Hayward. However, he ended up going to Butler University as he was recruited by their coach, Brad Stevens. At this point, Hayward was basically unknown to the general public. And going to Butler, which historically wasn't a great basketball school and only made the NCAA tournament 8 times in its school history, it didn't seem like Hayward was going to have a basketball career past college. Although Butler wasn't historically great at basketball, the team improved greatly in the few years before Hayward got there, with the help of Brad Stevens. The year before getting there, with Stevens as their new head coach, Butler had a historical best season of 30 wins and 4 losses. That next season, with Hayward as a freshman, the team ended the year with an impressive record of 26 wins and 6 losses. Hayward averaged 13 points and 6.5 rebounds a game, and got a couple awards as well. Helping the team to the NCAA tournament that year, they ultimately lost in the first round to LSU. In Hayward's sophomore season, he averaged over 15 points and 8 rebounds a game, leading Butler to a record of 33 wins and 5 losses, which was the most wins in the school's history. Hayward got numerous awards again that season, but most importantly, he led Butler to the NCAA tournament and further to their first NCAA championship appearance in school history. Sadly for Hayward, he had an attempt at a game-winning, buzzer-beating half-court shot, which ultimately missed, and Butler lost to the Duke Blue Devils in the championship game. At this point, everyone who watched college basketball knew exactly who Gordon Hayward was. Hayward's missed half-court shot is one of the most well-known shots in NCAA basketball history. And living with the fact that he could have won the game for his team, but didn't, was definitely something that was hard to deal with. Playing against the best of the best in college, and dominating most of the talent, Hayward ended up declaring for the 2010 NBA draft. Going into the draft, most people thought he would be in the middle of the first round. Sports Illustrated had him going 23rd place in the first round, and Bleacher Report had him going 13th. Although Hayward ended up going 9th place in the draft to the Utah Jazz, which ended up being 1 place ahead of Paul George. For his rookie contract, Hayward ended up signing a 4-year, $11 million deal. He wasn't really expected to do that much for the team immediately anyways. Although the Jazz had a dominant 53-29 record the year before, they ended up finishing that next season with a losing record, and Hayward, averaging 17 minutes a game, couldn't do much to help the team out. That next season, the Jazz switched some things around and ended up with a winning record, making the playoffs, but they ended up losing in the first round to the Spurs. Hayward massively improved that season, this year starting in 58 of 66 games, averaging over 30 minutes and 11 points per game. Through those next couple of seasons, Hayward consistently improved his stats, all the way up to the 2016-2017 season, when Hayward was getting over 21 points and 5 rebounds a game, and he even got his first All-Star appearance. The Jazz had some pretty solid players at that point, such as Rudy Gobert, George Hill, and Derek Favors, and the team ended up with the 5th best record in the Western Conference, with a record of 51 wins and 31 losses. Making it to the second round, the Jazz ended up losing to the eventual champions, Golden State Warriors. Gordon Hayward just had the best season of his career, and the Jazz also just had their best season in 7 years. But since Hayward's contract was up, it was time to sign a new deal, and Hayward was in for a big payday. At this point in his career, Hayward was making $15 million a year, and through his new contract, he ended up doubling that by signing a 4-year, $127 million contract with the Boston Celtics, who that previous season were the number 1 team in the Eastern Conference, and their coach, Brad Stevens, just so happened to be the coach who recruited Hayward to Butler University a few years before. Signing a max contract with the Boston Celtics, Hayward was now the 5th highest paid player in the NBA. Now honestly, when looking at the All-Star teams the year before that, it looked like Hayward was one of the worst players on the teams, meaning that he arguably wasn't even in the top 20 best players in the league at that point. Either way, Hayward was now on a Celtics team that may have been the best in the Eastern Conference. That offseason, the Celtics also lost their best player, Isaiah Thomas, but they gained a point guard that was arguably better, Kyrie Irving. Drafting Jason Tatum, a young star from Duke, it looked like the Celtics were in for a very good year, one that could possibly end with a better record than the year before. In the preseason, the Celtics had the 3rd best odds to win the championship, but tragedy struck early. In the first game of the season, Gordon Hayward had one of the scariest injuries in all of NBA history. I'm not going to show it, so don't worry, but let's just say it was quite a bad break of a bone in his leg. This injury put Hayward's whole career in jeopardy, and considering the Celtics just signed him to a 4-year, $127 million contract, it would also put the Celtics' future in jeopardy as well. Even without Hayward that season, the Celtics ended up with a pretty good record, coming in 2nd place in the Eastern Conference, and they even made it all the way to the Eastern Conference Final, where they lost in a close 7-game series to the LeBron-led Cleveland Cavaliers. That next year, Hayward came back from that brutal injury, and people weren't really expecting him to have a massive output for the Celtics right off the jump, and people even questioned if his career would ever be the same. In the year back from his injury, Hayward averaged about 26 minutes and 11 points per game. He looked well, but it was clear that he was still recovering. Hayward, who was one of the 2 stars of the Celtics from the year before, was now a player that was an afterthought on a team that finished the year as a 4 seed in the Eastern Conference, being booted out in the 2nd round to the Milwaukee Bucks. It was really until that next year, the 2019-2020 NBA season, where Hayward could have had his comeback season. Playing a full year after his injury, it was reasonable to think that Hayward was getting back into the groove of things, and that he possibly could go back to his old self. Kyrie Irving also left the team that offseason, so there was room for another star to be brought back into the mix. And even though the Celtics got Kemba Walker, it just felt like there was some more room for Hayward to get an elevated role. That season, Hayward started in all 52 games he played, and it seemed like he was getting back into the groove of things. Averaging over 33 minutes a game, Hayward was now averaging over 17 points, 6 rebounds, and 4 assists as well. Finishing 3rd in the Eastern Conference, it was thought by many that the Celtics had a legitimate chance of making the NBA Finals. LeBron wasn't in the East anymore, and the other teams they were competitive against seemed to be on a fairly equal playing field. For Gordon Hayward, this was his shot at a deep playoff run. But sadly, during Game 1 of the Celtics' first-round series against the 76ers, Hayward ended up getting injured, and was expected to miss about 4 weeks of play. This meant that Hayward still had a chance to make it back to play with the Celtics if they made a deep enough playoff run. In that first round, the Celtics ended up sweeping the 76ers, and then they went up against the Toronto Raptors. And in a great 7-game series, the Celtics came out ahead, and they were going to face up against the Miami Heat in the Eastern Conference Finals. With most people surprised that the Heat were even there in the first place, the Celtics were favored to win the series. The Celtics were still missing Hayward though, and this impacted their chances greatly. After losing the first 2 games of the series, Hayward was coming back for Game 3. Even though the Celtics ended up winning that 3rd game, The help from Hayward wasn't enough to defeat the Heat, and the Celtics ended up losing the series in 6 games. In that offseason, Hayward now had an option to either stay with the Celtics and make $34 million that next year, which was part of his guaranteed contract, or sign elsewhere. Being on a young team that had tons of potential, it made sense that Hayward would want to stay on the Celtics, and considering that he was going to make $34 million that year, it didn't seem like a bad deal. If the Celtics wanted to keep Hayward, that would also be great for the team, as the Celtics were consistently playing among the best in the league, and they had chances to make it out of the Eastern Conference and possibly win an NBA championship. With the Celtics wanting to keep Hayward, and Danny Ainge, the team's general manager, saying that Gordon Hayward was their number one priority in free agency, it was now up to the man himself for whether he would stay with the team. But Hayward surprisingly didn't want to stay in Boston. He had his eyes set for another team, the Charlotte Hornets. Hayward said that he wanted to go to the Hornets for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I'm sure the money had a big impact on his decision. The Hornets offered a 4-year, $120 million contract to Hayward, who was 30 years old at the time and had a history of injuries. Even though Hayward would have been guaranteed $34 million if he stayed with the Celtics, there was no saying what would happen after that year. If Hayward played bad or got injured again, his value could go down. And sometimes players drop from being worth $30 million to worth $5 or $10 million in a very short amount of time. So it made sense for Hayward to take the safe $120 million deal. Another reason why Hayward wanted to sign with the Hornets was because he wanted a bigger role on a team. He said, "I was in a different role after the injury and I tried to make the best of it. I firmly believe that I'm in the prime of my career. It was a tough decision to leave Boston, but it was something here where I wanted to maximize my potential and help the team win." If you watch the Hornets play at all this past season, you can tell that they have some potential, and a couple young players that will probably be all-stars in the future. Hayward was arguably the best player on the Hornets this past season, averaging about 20 points, 4 assists, and 6 rebounds a game in the 44 games he played for the team. The Hornets improved quite a bit from the previous year, with a 33-39 record opposed to a record of 23-42 the year before. Coming in 10th place in the Eastern Conference, the team made the play-in tournament and ended up losing. I wouldn't say I'm impressed with what the Hornets accomplished, but I definitely think they did well and have a bright future. And think of this, if the Hornets won 3 more games this season, they would have been in 7th place in the East, where the Boston Celtics ended up. So what's in Gordon Hayward's future? He's going to be 31 by the beginning of the 2021 NBA season, meaning that he probably only has a few years left in the league, depending on how long he wants to stay in the NBA. I don't think it's likely that Hayward improves his stats in the remaining years of his contract with the Hornets, since they have some young players that will probably get increased roles and minutes. I do think that Hayward will still be able to perform well and bring a lot to the Hornets organization, and I could see him not having a decline in his actual playing ability for the remaining years with his team. I would guess that once his contract is done with the Hornets, if he wants to stay on their team, he would probably have to take a bit of a pay cut, since the team will be signing their young players to massive deals within that time frame. I think it's possible that Hayward makes another All-Star game or two, and you never know, if he stays with the Hornets long enough, maybe he'll get to be a part of some other deep playoff runs, and maybe a championship winning team, headed by the greatest player of all time. What do you think Gordon Hayward's remaining years in the NBA will look like? Like, comment, subscribe, and thanks for watching.